Okay, so today I think I will first talk a little bit about another question that different from yesterday's, but of course related to yesterday's question, which is very important for comparative literature. Because many people would ask, what is the purpose of comparative literature? What would be more important for comparison? And the question of, this is actually the title of one of the essays I sent, that is difference or affinities. Should we compare to realize two different literatures or works, authors, whatever you compare, whether we should emphasize on the difference or emphasize on the affinities and similarities. So that's, I think, sometimes the comparatives often get asked this question, are you comparing to emphasize the difference or emphasize the similarity? I ask this question because related to my own experience about comparative literature. When I was in China, I was mostly reading different literatures and finding them very interesting, and also my mentor, Chen Rongsu, a great scholar, he often talks about the connections, different connections, very, very different literary phenomenon, very different texts, but they may have something very, very interesting, very similar. For example, one of his great essays, which I just translated into English, will be published next year in a special issue of Journal of World Literature. He has a wonderful essay. The essay's title is quoted from a Confucian analect's very famous phrase in the Chinese context. Every Chinese would know the phrase, very famous. The phrase, well, actually in the analect, Confucius talks about poetry. It doesn't talk much about literature, but there is one place it talks about poetry has 4 different functions. It says poetry can be stimulating, to raise your spirits and so on. So that's one function. Poetry can also be a tool for observing the social condition, because if people are happy, they will have happy songs, and basically the song and music, the poem, will reflect the social condition they are living in. If it is a bad time, if the society is suffering from a lot of problems, people's songs and poems would be complaining and so on. So poetry can serve as a tool to observe the social condition. In fact, in Han Dynasty in China, this is the 1st century before and after AD, BC and AD, 1 century and after. In Han Dynasty, there were offices set up to have officials to collect folk songs in different parts of the country as a way to collect information, how people are feeling about the time. So that was interesting. So Confucius talked about the different functions. The first function is to raise people's spirits and stimulating. The second is to observe society. The third function is a communal one, to make people feel together. Particularly when literati people, scholars come together, they always write poems and to make bond with themselves. So poetic connection, in a way, serving a communal function, that's a third. And then the last one, Confucius says, poetry is also a vent for your grievances. If you feel bad, if you suffer from something, if you have some pain in your life, you often write a poem to complain. So that poem becomes a release of your resentment and your frustrations and so on. So that's the last function. But Chen Rongsu, the great scholar, argues, if you look at the actual practice of poetry, the last function, even though Confucius mentioned 4, didn't really emphasize anyone. But the last function, the poetry becomes the event for your grievances, is actually the most important one. So he argues and has a lot of examples from classical Chinese literature to prove this point. And a very interesting example he quoted is from very important critical work in the 4th century in China, a very famous work called The Literary Mind, or the Carving of Dragons, which is a very famous work. In that work, there's one phrase, actually just one phrase, but he picked up this as important. The phrase says, it's commenting on one of the poets. That chapter is commenting many, many poets, and one of the poets, the text of this critical work says, he lives in a good time, but his career is very frustrated. He lives in a good time, but his career is not, smooth. He is very frustrated in his life, and because of that, he has written 2 very important works. And those works, it says, just like pearls in a thick oyster. Now, this phrase is very impressive. This phrase actually comes to an earlier book in the Chinese tradition from Huainanzi. It's a Taoist book. As I mentioned maybe yesterday, Taoism and Confucianism are very different. Confucianism is very much a humanism, considering things from a human point of view. But Taoists, as different from or unlike Confucians, often take a different point of view. And therefore, in this Taoist book, it says, pearls as bright as moons are very precious for humans, but actually is a product of a disease for the oyster. So it's really a change your perspective, change your point of view. If you look at a human point of view, of course, pearls are beautiful, particularly for ladies. They would like to have pearls as jewelry. But you can think the pearl actually is, for the oyster who produce the pearl, is a result of the disease. Something foreign get into the oyster, and the oyster has some excrement, and then round up and it becomes a pearl. So that's a very different view. But this view is in that Taoist book, but then it's taken up by his critic, Liu Xie, very famous, in commenting on poets. Basically, the idea is that the poets produce wonderful poems because of their painful frustrations, just like oysters produce beautiful pearls like moon as a disease. So that is a very interesting idea. And that idea, of course, is precisely what the idea that Confucius is talking about. Poetry can give vent to your grievances. So when you're painful, when you suffer, you're frustrated in life, then you can write very beautiful poems to express those. So the idea is that best poetry, the most touching poetry, is often writing about pain, about suffering, about frustrations, rather than about happy and pleasure and so on. Of course, poets can write about everything, but we find as readers, we find the tragic is often more moving than the comic. People always like to listen to sad stories rather than happy stories. And this is what Aristotle was also discussing in Poetics. At the very beginning, he asked the question, why people want to see and enjoy seeing something very painful, but presented on the stage. You don't want to have those things happen to yourself, but you love to watch them on the stage. That's a very interesting psychological question. Why people want to watch suffering? King Oedipus, he killed his father, married his mother, have children, incest, and then finally gorge out his eyes and exile himself from Thebes. Why do we want to watch that? You don't want to be like him. You don't want to have anything happen to you like Oedipus. But we watch Oedipus. Oedipus actually, the King Oedipus is probably the most important Greek tragedy that if you read Aristotle's Poetics, he had that in mind of him. Obviously, you can think that when he discussed the different characters and tragedy and so on. So in any case, that's a very interesting idea that poetic, the tragic is always much more moving and touching than the happy one. Now, then he, this is my, I'm still talking about my teacher, my mentor's essay. So the idea that poetry, the pearl of the oyster, thick oyster, is like the best work of a poet suffering from pain and frustration. And then he goes on to quote many, many Western works you find Heinrich Heine, Goethe, you have Victor Hugo, you have A. Hausmann, different poets from different literatures, German, French, American, English. They all have the same metaphor. They all, of course, now I cannot quote all these lines, but you find that in his essay, they all have the same idea that poetry is just like the pearl of the oyster, the sea oyster. So in different traditions, you have exactly the same metaphor to express the same idea. Actually, Shelley, P.B. Shelley, the English Romantic poet, has some lines very, very similar to this same idea. His great poem To the Skylark, there's a stanza that says, "We look before and after, and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought." That's a very famous stanza. And that expresses the same idea that our sweetest songs are those that tell the saddest thought. You know, the most beautiful songs are always about the tragic and suffering. So this is the type of literature, the type of comparative work that the great Chinese scholar did. And I was very much influenced by that. So I was also trying to look for similarities much more than differences. And I think difference is basically very obvious. You know, China is in Asia, France is in Europe, the French speak French, the Chinese speak Chinese, they don't speak the same language. You don't need a PhD to understand this, right? But what is scholarship is always discovery. Obviously, very different culture, very different history, very different social conditions. They write in different languages and different traditions. But then when you have examples, textual evidence of this, of similar expressions, you know, using pearl as a symbol for poetry to express this idea that the sweetest songs are those that speak of our saddest thought, then you find this is a kind of discovery. The discovery is about something that, of this idea that the best poetry is always expressing the sad feelings. So the idea of melancholic is very important. As we know that melancholic is very important for Renaissance literature, 17th century literature. You know, Browne has the anatomy of melancholy, and of course Hamlet as a figure is a melancholic, symbolic figure of a melancholic person. So all these are similarities. But when I went to America to study comparative literature in the 80s in particular, I suddenly realized in America everybody is talking about difference. Difference rather than similarity is definitely the word of the day. You know, of course, David Dyer has this wonderful concept of difference, and with not an E but an A to emphasize the difference of writing and speaking. And also, yesterday actually we mentioned this, Foucault, you know, this is wrong, I think you mentioned, Foucault opened his book, Le Mot les choses, or Order of Things, by quoting a so-called Chinese encyclopedia. Actually, it's quoted from Cortes. And the Chinese encyclopedia talks about the classification of animals, which doesn't make sense whatsoever. Nobody can understand. I mean, as a Chinese, I don't understand it either. Because they said that, you know, the animals are divided into different categories, and there are painted with very fine camel hair. This is one category. And then also etc. is another category. So many different categories doesn't make sense. But Foucault makes this, take it, you know, seemingly serious and say, well, this is how the Chinese think. You see, this is a totally different way of thinking. The Chinese think that way, therefore that's a challenge for our way of thinking, that is European or French way of thinking. Because we think logically. When we classify animals, we say, well, A, B, C, D, E, different categories. You know, for example, vertebrates, birds, or amphibians would be classified like this. But the Chinese don't do that. Chinese have very strange categories. There's one category look like flies. That's also a category of classification, which doesn't make sense before. Therefore, Foucault says this is a challenge to our way of thinking. We cannot think that. Therefore, he come up with this very important concept of heterotopia. The way of Chinese thinking, the classification of animals reflected in the so-called Chinese encyclopedia cannot be put in any space that makes sense, not even in utopia. Therefore, he has this idea of heterotopia. That's where China was. Now, when I read this, of course, because this is not insignificant, because Foucault, he says, at the very beginning of this important book, he says he wrote this book because he read Borges and he cannot resist to laugh. But in that laughter, he said, our way of thinking is completely shattered, because that's a challenge to our way of thinking. But of course, that was the stage when Foucault was more of a structuralist. The whole idea of the order of things is really to think of Western thinking or Western culture as a system, to define a different kind of episteme as different. So that is using China as an other, as I argue, to sort of emphasize the cultural difference. Because when you have difference, you can identify. This is what we know also from social linguistics. Things are not defined by in themselves. It's always by differentiation. When you say this is a table, this is a chair, because the table and chair are different. Now, if you imagine this, we only have table, never have chair. You don't even have a concept of table. You don't even have a concept of chair, because they are different, right? So the differentiation of things, by differentiating different things, you can identify this and that. So that's very, very important. So I find that in Western theory in the 1980s, a lot of emphasis was put on difference. Of course, people also talk about gender difference, class difference, race difference, and so on. All kinds of differences that seem to make all the important possibility of thinking. So when I study also further, I was reading Derrida and Foucault, all very important theorists. Derrida, I was reading Derrida's Of Grammatology, a very important book, in which he argues that the whole tradition of Western philosophy or Western culture is what he called the logocentric tradition, logocentrism. So what is logocentrism? Logocentrism is basically what he called a metaphysical hierarchy. You have thinking, inner thinking, and then you have speech. Speech is closer to thinking. Then you have writing. Writing is farther away from speech and farther away from thinking. And therefore the Western alphabetic language, phonetic language, is trying to catch the actual voice. So logocentrism is also what he called phonocentrism. So phony, the sound, can directly express the inner thinking, and writing is always debased. So the hierarchy of thinking, speech, and writing is what he called the metaphysical hierarchy that represents the logocentric or phonocentric idea. And then he turned around. Of course, he doesn't know Chinese or Japanese, but he says, well, Japanese and Chinese use characters. Those characters are not phonetic, not alphabetic writing. Therefore, that proves outside of logocentrism, there are some civilizations, like Chinese civilization. It's completely outside of logocentrism. Now, for Derrida, this is meant as a praise. The Chinese are very good because they don't have logocentrism. They're not concerned with this. They don't have this metaphysical hierarchy, and so on. But it creates a lot of problems because, just like Foucault began by talking about the Chinese encyclopedia, which is not Chinese at all, which was written by Cortes, to represent a completely different way of thinking and come up with this idea of heterotopia. And as a Chinese myself, I find that's very, very funny. Because if you think of logocentrism, metaphysical hierarchy, then in China, that's exactly the tradition in Chinese philosophy. So I remember when I was, because before when I went to the US in 1983. At the time I was already reading of grammatology, but before I went to America in 1982, we had the first Sino-American Comparative Literature Symposium. So I was on the Chinese side. I was the youngest member of the Chinese team. We have 10 people, and there's also 10 professors from America. Erminer was he was of Princeton. He was the head of the delegation. There are 10 people from different universities. So I got to know all the professors. So as soon as I was in the U.S., they invited me to give talks to different universities. The first one I was invited to was to UPenn, actually. Barbara Henston Smith at that time was the university professor in UPenn, and she was in the delegation in China, so we became friends. And Erminer organized a very, a big honor for me, actually. At that time, I didn't have any idea. I was fresh from China, didn't know. It's a great honor. Because he asked me to give the Eberhard Faber Class 1950 Memorial Lecture in Princeton, which was never given by a graduate student, or never given, always a distinguished professor. I was a graduate student at Harvard at that time, but of course, they listed me as a professor from Peking University, not a graduate student from Harvard, to give this in Princeton. So when I gave that lecture, my lecture is called The Tao and the Logos, Notes on Derrida's Critique of Logocentrism. Basically, I was saying, Derrida of grammatology criticized Hegel, criticizes many other European thinkers, and also Leibniz, earlier thinkers, basically saying that they didn't get it right, they didn't quite understand China or Chinese as very different from the European, as though he got it right. So I began by talking about very traditional European understanding of China. This is related to what we were talking about yesterday. I began by quoting Hegel. Hegel, in his preface to the Greater Logic, he mentioned that the Chinese as a language was sort of underdeveloped, which is not a phonetic language. For Hegel, phonetic language is the language that can get closer to inner thinking. This is exactly what Derrida was criticizing as a logocentric idea. And of course, in Plato, you find that very important. Plato, in addition to his dialogues, he also has some letters, and the seventh letter of Plato is very important as a philosophical letter, in which he argues that written symbols are the least reliable. So he said nobody who has thought, reasoned, with reasoned thinking, would dare to put what he has thought in rational ways, thank you very much, in writing. So that's certainly debasement of writing in Western tradition. Hegel also did that, and Hegel said the Chinese was undeveloped language because they didn't really have phonetic writing. This is what I joked when we were in the car, because I also, when I was young, I learned Russian by myself, and in in Russian language, the German, the Deutsch, it's called Yemetsky Yazik, which literally means the language of the dumb. People cannot speak. This is very common in all old traditions, in Greek and Chinese. Always think their own language is the only language that speaks and has value, and other language you don't understand is some kind of animal sound or birds and so on. So that's very common. I mean, remember Aristophanes had a play called Birds. That's exactly where the Greek can say, I will teach them to speak Greek because they are speaking birds language. Anyway, this is the idea of the civilized and barbarian, which we're all familiar with from Greek tradition. But in China has exactly the same idea. So when I was criticizing Hegel, I said Hegel is very proud of his own idea because he said in German we have a wonderful word Aufhebung, which means exactly the two opposite meanings. Aufhebung can be raised up, can be put down, can be a negation, but also preservation. So it's two different things in the same word. And therefore, he proves that German language is suitable for philosophizing, while Chinese is not. Of course, he didn't know any Chinese. This is very interesting. People, Derrida, Foucault, Hegel, all these great thinkers, can talk about Chinese without knowing a single word of Chinese. That's So I was jokingly saying, well, Hegel didn't realize his beloved Muttersprache actually is called by Russians the language of the dumb. But anyway, more seriously, I argue the so-called metaphysical hierarchy. If you look at the metaphysical hierarchy of thinking, speech, and writing, then you find that's very traditional in China. I use none other than the very famous book translated many times into English called Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu, the Taoist book. The Taoist book begins by this, and why they begin this is a story, because Sima Qian, the great historian in China, writing about Lao Tzu, the author of this book, Lao Tzu lived in Zhou, the state of Zhou. When he saw that the Zhou state is in decline, he wanted to leave. So when he goes to the city pass, the pass keeper asked him to write down a book and saying, well, you are now leaving us. If you don't write a book, so we don't know, nobody will remember what you are teaching. So we finally wrote a book of 5,000 characters. But he began by saying, actually it's useless. Because the very first line he says, the Tao, usually the English translation doesn't really get it. Usually in English translations, the way that can be spoken of is not the constant way. The name that can be named is not the constant name. Now, what is interesting is that the way here translated in Chinese called Tao, like Taoism. That's a very important concept. Tao is the highest of philosophical notion, just like logos in Greek. And also just like logos, Tao means both the idea and language. Logos, of course, means both speak and what is spoken. I'm now talking alone, it's monologue. When we have two people talking about, it's dialogue. So log comes from logos. That's speech, it's language. But of course, many disciplines like biology, philology, logic, all come from logos. That is the content of what you speak. And in China, Tao means exactly the same. Tao is the very highest notion of the highest way translated. But it's also, the verb to speak is also called Tao. So actually the Chinese, the very first line of Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching, in Chinese, listen to the Chinese original. Dao ke dao, fei chang dao. So listen to three Dao. Dao ke dao, fei chang dao. So the first and the third is the highest notion of Tao, and the second is spoken. So when I translate into English, I made this point. I say the Tao that can be Taoed, and so it's a verb with ed. The Tao that can be Taoed is not a constant Tao, and Tao, of course, is spoken. So that philosophical notion, when you speak of it, it's already not the constant Tao. So even more radical than logocentric, even speak is already falling out from the inner thinking. And of course, negation of writing is very common in Taoist ideas. Another great book in Taoism is Zhang. Zhang is a great philosopher, and he always has wonderful stories, allegories to talk about his philosophical ideas. Very interesting idea is a story about a wheelwright, somebody who's making wheels. His name is Pian. And one day, the Duke of Huan, a very important prince at the time, was reading in his hall. And this wheelwright is making wheels in front of the hall. And then the wheelwright put down his tools and came up to the Duke and asked him, "My lord, what kind of words are you reading?" The Duke of Huan says, the words of the ancients. It's very Chinese and traditional. You respect the ancients, right? And then they were asking, are the ancients still alive? They said, no, they're dead. And then the word says, then, my lord, what you're reading is only the dregs of the ancients. The Duke was not pleased. So the Duke said, we must have given me a good explanation, or otherwise the punishment is death. So the old man says, well, you see, I am a 70-year-old. Now I'm actually 71 years old. I'm already 70 years old. All my life I'm making wheels. The way to make wheels is something that is very subtle, because when the wood is too young, if you cut too soon, you cannot make a perfect wheel because it will become different. And then when the wood is too dry, you cut it too slow, you cannot make a wheel. So the right time, you can't really make a perfect wheel. Is kind of a knack, I know, but I cannot even express. So even my own son cannot learn it from me. I can't teach my own son how to make the wheel. So how can the wisdom of the ancients still exist in those dead words? So you can see this is a perfect example of putting down writing. Thinking, speech, writing, it's very clearly in Chinese tradition. Very important books, not just some weird argument. This is one of the major traditions in Chinese philosophy. So how can you say that Longxi is only Western way of thinking? The Chinese are different. So I presented this as a kind of a critique of Derrida's ideas. And very interestingly, before my essay was very soon actually published in Critical Inquiry, which is one of the best journals in the US. Before it was published, Derrida was lecturing at Yale University. So I drove from Harvard to Yale and met him, and I introduced myself and gave him my manuscript. And he was very nice. He said, well, why not we have a conversation? So the next day, he made an appointment to talk with me. And again, it's very funny because Yale, unlike Harvard, the environment at Yale is not very safe in New Haven. Maybe some of you must know. So the Office of Comparative Literature is on top of the, it's blocked by the library. So you cannot go by staircase, you have to take an elevator. And you must be affiliated with Yale to have a key to the elevator. So I was standing there, I have no affiliation. I couldn't go up to the office to see them. So I was waiting there, but somebody came up and asked me, look at me, and I don't look very dangerous. He asked me where I want to go. So finally I pushed the button, so I get to see Derrida for, actually, we talked about more than 2 hours in the afternoon, quite nice. And of course, Derrida couldn't have much of a debate with me because it didn't know any Chinese at all, so it couldn't argue with me. But finally, he asked me a very loaded question, a very sort of Foucauldian or Derridian question. He said, are you saying Taoism and Longxi are the same? I said, you are the master de différence. A and B, how can they be the same? Of course not the same. When you say A and B, when you have this sort of word and that already indicates they're different. But because you are saying Chinese thinking is totally, absolutely different from Greek or Western European way of thinking, I would say to point out a lot of similarities, to say there are a lot of similarities and affinities. But suppose you or somebody like with your influence are saying China is just like Greek. Chinese think exactly like the Greek. I would say no, they are very different. So it's all dependent on the environment, the kind of question you are answering. So I always consider scholarship as a kind of dialogue, just like Gadamer argues. You are responding to a question. And here, I'm responding to what I see as an overemphasis on difference. Everything is different, as though difference by itself is valuable. I find that's a problem. So when I come back to the first question, when we do comparative studies, should we emphasize on difference or should I emphasize on similarity? I think that question is meaningless without a context. You have to put in the actual context, a practical, theoretical context. What the purpose of your comparison. What are you doing? What trying to achieve? If you are, analyzing some specific work to emphasize its specific nature, to differentiate from others, for example, different genres, how poetry is different from drama, how narratives is different from poetry, then of course you emphasize their differences. Point out, usually poem is rhymed, prose is not, as the good gentleman learned in Moliere's comedy that, Monsieur Jourdan was taught by the teacher that there are two kinds of literature. One is poetry, one is prose. And he said, oh, I didn't realize I've been spoken prose for 40 years. So that's indeed, if you want to talk about the difference of prose and poetry, of course you want to talk about the differences. But when you are responding to what I see in the West, in particular in America, there's a kind of overemphasis on difference. Not only overemphasis on difference, and also as a Chinese, I see the kind of exoticization of Chinese culture. The Chinese have to be different, because how can they be like us? This of course, from the postmodern point of view, is a good thing to complement the Chinese, because they are very different. Because we Westerners have the logocentric ideas, so we have a bad tradition. The Chinese don't, therefore they're good. But that's exactly the same argument the racists, the colonializers used to argue. How can they be the same? Of course, we are civilized, they are barbarians, therefore we have to civilize them, even kill them, because they're not like us. So I see this not necessarily the difference is, ethically speaking, is better. I don't see that. Exoticization, to keep the other always as different, that is a problem. Just like Foucault's idea of heterotopia, China is not a heterotopia. The kind of passage from Borges is not a Chinese encyclopedia. By the way, Borges himself never used that encyclopedia to emphasize the difference between the East and West. Because for Borges, encyclopedia is a very, very commonly used metaphor. To symbolize human effort to understand God's secret. Library classification is always the human effort to classify or systematize our knowledge, to figure out what God's secret is. But of course, always fail, because God's secrets cannot be understood completely by human beings. But the effort itself is heroic. They fail. It's definitely it's a failing effort, but the effort itself is worthwhile. It's what humans do. I think that's what Borges was talking about, because he mentioned the so-called Chinese encyclopedia in tandem with Britannica or Brockhaus and some of the real encyclopedias. Borges always do this. Always mix the real and the unreal together, and all the critics were confused and saying that's wonderful erudition. It's very hard to trace down his references. But some of the references are made up. You cannot trace down because there's no such a book in existence. Anyway, so Borges is not the kind of dichotomize the East and West, but Foucault's use is dichotomizing. So I find that's a problem. So therefore, I in many of my works, I always emphasize on the similarities rather than the difference, because similarities is what make all of us, of different cultures, different races, different groups, all human. I think that's ethically deeply important, because to emphasize difference is a kind of racist thinking. In 19th century, particularly in French tradition, a very famous, important sociologist and anthropologist, has this idea of the mentalite. Every nation, every race has its own mentalities, very different. And that has influenced a lot of French thinking about different cultures. Actually, he has a book on the Amazonian, precisely in Brazil. The Amazonian people think in unlogical, aesthetic way of thinking, but Europeans think logically. So for Europeans, you have the differentiation of logic and aesthetics. But for the Brazilians, or not you, but the tribes around the Amazons, they only have aesthetic way of thinking. They don't know what is logic, you see. So I think that's also something, you know, potentially dangerous, actually. You know, it's kind of dehumanizing. I would believe whatever race, you know, maybe a baby born in the Amazon rainforest, if you take the baby to New York and let him or her grow up in New York, it would become like any other Americans. You know, it's all depending on the environment we are living. You know, our language and culture and social upbringing is dependent on our environment, not decided by kind of gene or racial some kind of characteristic. I don't think so. So for me, I think arguing for the similarities and affinities, not necessarily, but I must emphasize similarity and affinity doesn't mean identity, doesn't mean exactly the same. They're different. But so the difference and similarities are always there. I mean, we're all different because we don't even look alike. How can we be exactly the same, right? Every face is identifiable. Every fingerprint, our DNA chains are all very different. So that's how we identify ourselves, even within the same race, not to say different races. But at the same time, we're all human. I think that's very important, particularly for literature. I mean, literature is the art of language, is art of human expressions. So I think that's a very important idea. For me, I think without putting everything into one block and say we're all the same, that's not important, that's not interesting. But to overemphasize difference, to say, we're so different that this way of understanding is different, we have different ways of thinking. I find, for example, this is not just French, but the Americans as well. I mean, there's an American professor published a book not very long ago by, what's his name, Nisbet. He's a psychologist in Michigan. He has a book called Westerners and Asians Think Differently and Why. That's a book title, actually. He tells you all the Westerners think in one way and all Asians think a different way. It's too much of a generalization. Asians, who is the Asian? The Chinese, Japanese, Indians, Muslims, and who is the Westerner? The French, the German, the Portuguese, the Spanish, they all think the same way. I think that's too much of a generalization. So I find all these things, all this kind of emphasis not very helpful. And particularly when you read literature, I mean, literary works are always unique in a sense. They're all very different. Every poem is different from any other poem. And this is our hope of humanities, because this is something the robots cannot do. The computers cannot write poems, I think. They may beat us in chess playing, but I don't think computers can ever beat us in writing poetry. Anyway, poems are always different, but poems are also, as I mentioned, you can find the same metaphor using pearl as the expression of poetry, as the expression poetry as the best poetry is the expression of pain and suffering that you find in different literatures. This is kind of thing that I'm more interested in. So that's a question of difference and affinity. So in general, to come to a conclusion, that is, it's meaningless to talk of whether we should emphasize on difference or similarity without a context. Within certain contexts, we can talk about which is more important. But for me, I think overemphasis on difference, as though overemphasis on difference as ethically superior position, I find that's completely wrong. Because the argument for difference, particularly racial difference, is precisely what the racists do. And also the eugenics, in early 20th century, people in eugenics also studied the difference of different races and so on. All those, we all know, lead to very dangerous conclusions. So maybe this is what I want to talk today as a kind of introduction, and then we can have more discussions.
Okay. If word literature is an idea that changes in response to local needs and context, is it possible to think about a word of word literature truly global?
Plural or?
Truly global. Is it possible to think? Is word literature an ethical way of being the word?
Yes. Well, I have argued that word literature has to be localized. In different places, when you study word literature and when you talk about word literature, it's always related to your own tradition, the literature you are familiar with. Therefore, I don't think word literature is one thing that becomes the only thing in every different, situations. For example, I just came, before I came to Brazil, I just had 1 day back in Hong Kong. Before that, I was in Tokyo teaching. Harvard has an Institute for World Literature. Every year they have different places. This year it was in Tokyo, in University of Tokyo in Japan. So I was 2 weeks teaching the seminar, and back to Hong Kong 1 day, and I came here. Anyway, so in Harvard's Institute, for example, every year the different people teaching seminars on world literature, or generally under the umbrella concept of world literature, but each one have different syllabus, have different materials, and therefore I think that's the case, and it has to be the case. For example, a professor in Japan, he probably will quote a lot of, or use a lot of Japanese literature as one way to compare with European, with Western literature, as talking about comparative in the world literature. I would imagine if you have a seminar in Brazil, taught by a professor here, you certainly would use Brazilian literature or Latin American literature as a very important source or resource to compare with other literatures in Europe, in the East, in other parts of the world. And therefore, I think world literature is always localized when it's taught, when it's studied. Just like comparative literature. Comparative literature also is different in different places. It depends on what tradition you are most familiar with, where you come from. So for me, for example, I always refer to classical Chinese tradition because that's where I'm familiar with, and also I'm interested in Western literature, European literature. This is what I do in my comparative studies.
It's not a question, just a way to listen more to your reflections. I was relating what you just said now with the final moments of your yesterday class. Because it seems to me that actually what you are criticizing in Derrida and Foucault, and we could just name so many others, is the way they naturalize their own position. They see themselves so in such a central position that actually everyone else becomes the absolute other. In your case, it's Chinese. But Derrida and Foucault, they have been to Brazil several. Derrida twice or thrice, Foucault the same. The way they would treat Brazilian thinking would be pretty much the same. We would be the absolute other. We would be the tropical, so forth and so on. So it seems to me that you are actually criticizing the fact that whoever is in a central position tends to naturalize their own position. There was a recent book published, this dialogue between Umberto Eco and Jean-Claude Carrière. The title is something like, do not count on the end of the books. It's a long dialogue. There is a moment when Jean-Claude Carrière asks Umberto Eco if it is possible that they are missing a masterpiece, for instance, it says Carrière, from Hungary or Bulgaria, whatever. And then Umberto Eco says, no, not at all. Because actually, literature of such a level, such as Shakespeare, only happens where the decisive facts of humanity are taking place. And then Umberto Eco asks, would you imagine a Hemingway in Paraguay? It's very revealing. Because in Paraguay, he would not think of a Joyce. He would think of Hemingway, which is already quite revealing. But then actually, Paraguay has a James Joyce in the 20th century that a lot of you knows very well. It's called Augusto Roa Bastos, who as a novelist, as a fiction writer, is much more powerful than Umberto Eco and Jean-Claude Carrière together. So I think the point is the way they naturalize their position. And then the question that I was going to ask you yesterday, don't you think that we have to perhaps also not only talk about circulation, as David Damrosch, and I think that you add a very important point, which is translation plus scholarship. But we have a problem that perhaps we're never going to be able to overcome. It is the reception. How is it that Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Umberto Eco, Jean-Claude Carrière, one day, and of course I'm just naming them as an example, when they would be able to read a Chinese poetry or a Brazilian novel without exercising us. So these are things that is a tremendous challenge, is the level of reception.
Yes, I think the reception is important, and the reception, as I argued, very much depends on scholarship. It's not just translation of the poems or translation of the novel, but really follow up with very good explanatory essays and scholarship to explain the value of the work. Why particularly people outside the tradition should read it. This is also what I think David Damrosch's definition is helpful. That is, our work has to be circulating beyond its culture of origin, otherwise it would remain in the national tradition. It's not a part of world literature. So I think that's important. But circulating, how do you circulate? How do we understand a very different cultural product? You know, a very different work of literature coming from a different tradition. I think there are two things I want to talk about. First of all, is we understand a culture when the culture becomes more influential. Think of Shakespeare. Think of all the great Western works. Because we have been, in the last 200 years, I think many of the non-Western tradition cultures have been trying to understand Western culture because they are powerful. In case of China, China has a long history and it's very, very powerful in the past. But in the last 200 years, it's very weak. China was defeated by the British in the Opium War, and then suffered from many unequal treaties from, many of the Western powers had unequal treaties and have what they call extraterritoriality. That is, they have their own law practiced in China. If somebody, a Westerner or resident or somebody, committed a crime, they will not be tried by Chinese judges, they will try it by themselves. So this is kind of condition. And therefore, this is true of all non-Western cultures, all try to understand and learn from Western culture. Therefore, our understanding of what Western literature also become closer to what they understand themselves, right? But then if the culture is periphery or semi-periphery one, then it's harder to have the work, or harder to have, for example, Europeans and Americans to understand Chinese or Brazilian literature as we do understand our own. Very often, for example, I know China better. Very often the most famous Chinese poets, famous outside China, are not the best Chinese poets. Are not the best Chinese poets. Well, they are, reasonably good Chinese poets. For example, Tang poetry. Everybody knows Tang poetry is the golden time of classical Chinese poetry. The greatest Chinese poet is Du Fu in China. But Du Fu is very difficult to translate and very hard to understand without certain scholarship or embedded in the tradition. But first, the Japanese, before the Westerners know Chinese poetry, Japanese, they even read classical Chinese. The best poet the Japanese received very well is called Bai Junyi. He writes much simpler and much easier to translate. And therefore he became much more popular than Li Bo or Du Fu, the greatest two great Chinese poets outside. So there is this kind of discrepancy between the Chinese classical tradition and how the Chinese understand their own tradition and the outside reception of their works. Even Goethe, I mentioned it yesterday, reading a great Chinese novel, but the novel was not the Dream of Red Mansion, which is the greatest Chinese novel. He didn't read that. He read one of the minor ones. And of course, that's important. Another example is very powerful influence of Chinese poetry in modern Western poetry is through Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound, of course, very, very influential. And Ezra Pound basically sort of revolutionized modern Western poetry, not just in English, even other languages. And Ezra Pound has a total misunderstanding of how Chinese language worked. He has he edited, not he wrote, but he edited the essay by Ernest Fenollosa, Chinese written language as a medium for poetry, which became the basis of what is called imagism, Ezra Pound's idea of poetry. Basically thinking the Chinese language is all images. The Chinese is a pictographic language, it's a pictures. So when you look at Chinese poetry, it's image after image. There's no conjunction word, there's no, again, all the logic get rid of. You don't say in that place or out. So all these prepositions, all these words that make things fixed in Western poetry becomes the impediment. I understand you wanted to ask something.
You mentioned that sometimes highlighting differences might depend on the context. Highlighting differences would be worthy when talking about comparative literature, right? So I was wondering if you could give examples on what kind of studies you think bringing differences would be something important.
Okay. Actually, I'm thinking of one of the essays I wrote. Actually, it's translated into Portuguese, and I think now it's available. It's called On Comparison. Now, the essay was, why I wrote this is because a few years ago, a journal in the US is called New Literary History, which is, again, a very good journal. And Rita Felsky became the editor-in-chief of New Literary History. And she invited me to be an advisory editor, so I became an advisory editor. And one of the things after that was, some years ago, New Literary History has a special issue called On Comparison. They talk about comparison as a concept. And she asked me, because what they do is that they have a special issue and then they want to publish as a book. And when they publish as a book, you often add a few essays. So Rita asked me to write an essay on comparison, the idea of comparison. Before I wrote that essay, I read the special issue first. And then when I read the special issue, I find I was unhappy with some of the essays in that special issue, because some of the people were talking about comparison as though something shouldn't do. You shouldn't compare. Now, this is related to, I think we talked about yesterday, why David Damrosch only used circulation as a definition of world literature rather than talk about, what is good about literature or what is the aesthetic value or literary value and all this. So value judgment was actually something people really shy away from, because the value judgment is basically to have two things to compare and say, well, this is better, this is not as good as the other. And this is something now in America you don't do that, because as soon as you say this is better than that, then you create a hierarchy. Remember, metaphysical hierarchy is something bad. You don't do that. And also, you exert a power relationship. You become a control of something. And you don't want to marginalize anybody or anything. So you don't do comparison. You don't talk about value at all. And that is a big problem, I think. Therefore, some people are saying comparison is inherently discriminating, because criticism means discrimination, not in the bad sense. I mean, kritos in Greek means to criticize, to differentiate, to discriminate, to precisely make a judgment of one from other. So comparison itself is a differentiation. So I read those essays. I find that again it's kind of a pseudo kind of ethical position, as though you give up comparison, you become a better person. I don't think so. You just sort of beg the question. You don't do it. That doesn't mean that the question is solved. So I began by saying comparison. I began by actually misquoting Shakespeare. I said, to compare and not to compare, that is not the question. Because we always compare. Comparison is ontological. We have to compare. You know, sometimes when I was teaching in the US particularly, sometimes I joke with my graduate students. I always teach a graduate seminar, and they were saying that don't have a metaphysical hierarchy, don't discriminate or something. I said, well, let us think about this. In the morning when you get up, you must decide you should eat your breakfast before you brush your teeth. Or some people brush your teeth before you eat your breakfast. You have to make a decision. Now, when you decide to do one, you exclude the possibility of the other. Now, is that something you don't do? You of course do. You always do. You cannot just sit there and never decide to brush your teeth or eat your breakfast. So you have to do one of this. So life is always filled with comparisons. Decision making is comparison. Remember the Robert Frost famous poem, "The road not taken," right? You go to a crossroad, I take the one that is less tread, and that makes all the difference. And I quote also, talking about similarity, a Chinese philosopher, Yang Zhu, very old philosopher, more than 2,000 years. He is a philosopher, he's an old man. He was weeping at the crossroads. Why? According to the classical text. Because the road can lead to the north or to the south. Now, if you take that literally, well, what's the big deal? I mean, you go to the north, if that's the way you come back, and to the south, but then, of course, that's a symbol. It's not really about taking the crossroad. It's making a decision. When you get married, you have to decide which one you want to marry. You kind of say, well, this is good, that is also good. But you have to make a decision, right? When you go to a university, you have to decide, I want to study literature, I want to study mathematics, or I want to physics. All kinds of decisions are very important in your life. You have to make a decision. And when you do, you always compare. How do you decide? Your value in, this, I want to go to literature because I'm interested. I'm interested in humanities. This is very, very important. Or I'm a mathematic person. I want to be an engineer. I want to make machines. So you make those decisions. So we always make decisions and always compare. So for me, comparison is ontologically important. And also I use two important theoretical arguments. One is Freud, psychoanalysis, and I quote one particular essay he wrote, a beautiful essay. Freud writes beautifully. He was a book review, actually, a German linguist or philologist, talking about Egyptian language. In Egyptian language, there are always pairs, of words. And Freud commenting on this and says, we understand words because they are different. Now, suppose we only have light, we never had darkness, then you would not have a word for light. You don't even have a concept of light, because only against darkness you know what light is. That, of course, is very important for linguistics, for Saussure's linguistics. And he defines language as a system of differentiations. He says, usually when you say different, you have one positive term against which you have a negative term as different. But he says in language there's no positive terms. They are all defined mutually. As I talked about earlier, table and chair, and there are so many concepts. We have left hand, right hand, we have up and down, before and after. All these concepts are all in comparison. So we live in comparison. We always do comparison. So to say that comparison is something you can choose to do or not to do is completely wrong. You always do. So comparison is necessary, it's something that we live with. So the question is not to compare or not to compare. As I said, it's not a question. The question is, what do we do and what is the purpose of a comparison? And that is an ethical issue. Because what you make a decision, particularly important decision, that will influence not only your own life, maybe also influence other people's life. If you're in a powerful position, then what you decide will influence a lot of people's life and their life. So I think the ethics of comparison is related to that kind of comparison, what we do, what is the purpose. So this is all very philosophical and very abstract, but when we come to the comparative literature, what time we would compare and to talk about difference. Again, in generic studies, when you talk about genres, or when you talk about a specific author, his style, how that different from other people, and how the ideas are different, the way they express his ideas, the statistics, and all this. There are many, many details you can talk about. And when you talk about an author, you contrast the author with another one, and then try to find his own specific style. And that is the specific, and that's the difference you emphasize. But also, comparison doesn't have to be all talk about the specific difference, because even difference makes sense only within a context of comparables. If two things are completely impossible to compare, what is called incompatibility or incommensurability, then you cannot even begin to understand, to compare. And this is something I find, I also have a discussion or to critique of the idea of incommensurability. Incommensurability is a concept that was very famous, raised by Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And his argument is that scientific revolution of new science is working, a group of scientists always working under a paradigm. And that paradigm defines the way they think, that defines the way they do scientific job. And therefore, when a totally different paradigm happens, then you have a revolution in science. And his example is a famous debate between the Copernicans and the Ptolemaic. One is heliocentric. Copernicus says, well, the world is around the sun. We're all around the sun. The revolution of the Earth, of the galaxy, is around the sun. But the Ptolemaics argue this epicentric, because God lives on Earth. The Earth has to be the center. Therefore, sun and every other planet must be revolving around the Earth. Now, they of course have a debate. Thomas Kuhn's argument is that they cannot understand each other because they're completely different. So their paradigms is incompatible. So he famously stated in the book, he says, after a scientific revolution, the scientists work in a different world. Now, that idea, of course, was, well, Thomas Kuhn was talking about history of science, but his influence was much more in literature than in history of science, actually. In philosophy, has been criticized by many, many philosophers. I quoted two important American philosophers. One is Hilary Putnam, and he's a professor of philosophy at Harvard. Another is David Davidson, all very, very good philosophers in America. Davidson particularly has a very good way of putting this. It says, of course, to talk about difference is nice, because that's how we recognize things. But difference makes sense only on a basis of comparables. If they're totally different, you don't even begin to understand. You think of a foreign language, you completely, it's alien to you. The sound doesn't make any sense to you. You hear the sound, you don't understand the language. Therefore, you cannot debate with them. Debate is also a communication. The Copernicans and the Ptolemaics understood perfectly well what the other side was saying, because the other side was really attacking the core of their theory. So debate is based on communication and understanding. So you cannot say because they are totally different, they don't even begin to understand each other. Of course they do. if you don't understand each other, there's no debate, there's no quarrel. Because somebody's calling your name, you'll be angry. If you don't understand what he's scolding you, you don't even begin to argue, right? So really, totally, incomprehension is not the way to talk about different scientific models. But unfortunately, incommensurability becomes very influential in social science and humanities. So people, again, as I said, I find in the West there's an overemphasis on difference.
As you know, David Damrosch, in his anthology about world literature, theory of world literature, one of the texts that is there, I mean in the paper version because it's not in the digital version, and even David didn't know this. I told him and he was amazed it was not there. Marcel Detienne has an essay about comparables, and he says that comparables are orientations, and of course he's a historian and a specialist in classical age, Western classical age, of course, not Eastern classical age. But what I would say is, as you, I believe, from reading your work, that basically there are some things that you believe are at stake when we talk about comparison. And the first thing is the real possibility, meaning as of course as grounds for comparison, of cross-cultural understanding. The first thing that would be, let's say, at the core of what you say, meaning that all those theories about radical differentiation, a differentiation that would make it impossible for cultural understanding, are not exactly something that you would agree with. That's
true, yes.
If I understood correctly. And but anyway, even thinking from this perspective, what I would ask you is, if you're making a comparison between let's say two objects, could be two authors, two literary works, or whatever else we can imagine in a specific context. And what would you say would be important to take into consideration? Meaning, if you at least you have two objects and a theory that would, in a way, or an idea that would be the reason for you to compare both of them, the reason for you to put all of the two of them together, either to understand their affinity or to understand their difference, but knowing anyway that there is something between the two of them that can be brought about by the theory or by the idea that you have raised to make the comparison.
When I was earlier talking about affinities and similarities, what would be the really significant difference? And there are sometimes things can be different and unique even in a culture, but that may not be very essential for the culture. I often joke about this. I mean, I say, for example, in Chinese food, tofu is something specific to Chinese. You don't find that in any other cooking or cuisine. You know, tofu is made of soybeans and it's like cheese, but it's not cheese, right? It's white and so on. And the earlier English translation is bean curd, which is not what tofu really is. So tofu is, you can say, uniquely, specifically Chinese. But I don't consider tofu as representing Chinese culture, the essence of Chinese culture. And also I don't think tofu is untranslatable. it is untranslatable if you translate into any kind of, like bean curd or whatever. But now in English, we call it tofu, T-O-F-U, is a proper, already a dictionary entry. You can find the word in Webster Dictionary, it becomes a new word. I mean, this is the way we often deal with real differences in language. We just, transliteration. We just call its own name in its original, So this is one way of dealing untranslatabilities. So, even though I often talk about similarities against the kind of overemphasis in the West on difference, but I do think there are some important, significant differences between Chinese culture and Western culture. For example, I talked about the very different way of value system. In China, religion is never considered very important. So the Chinese do not have an exclusive religion. So this is very difficult for people who have Christianity or Islam or even Buddhist to understand, because you think of almost all people from ancient time to modern, most of the people would have their own religion system. I mean, for the Greeks, the gods are their religion. We call it mythology. This is already a biased view from the Christian point of view. From Christian point of view, looking at ancient Greek religion, we call it mythology because it's not God. But that's a pantheism, which you find not only in Greek but also in Egyptian religion, Indian religion. In India, cows and monkeys can be holy, also. And then you have this Abrahamic religion. First, the Jewish people have the religion of one God and one God only. In the Bible, God declares, "I'm a jealous God." Jealous meaning you can only worship me. And that is, of course, what jealous means in a secular situation, but it comes from the Bible. And you have, from Jewish religion, you have the Christians. The only difference is that Christians acknowledge Jesus as God, but the Jews reject that. But the idea of the Messiah coming to save us at the end of time, the idea of eschatology, the idea of apocalypse, all Jewish ideas. But the only difference is that the Messiah hasn't come for the Jews. But for the Christians, he has come, but the first time we didn't believe him. So there's a second coming. Yeats has a beautiful poem called The Second Coming. And that's when God will come and then hopefully will accept. That's Christian idea. But the Chinese don't have all this. Because in China, it's not that the Chinese don't have ideas about gods, deities, or all kinds of spirits. They do. But this is the influence of Confucius, because Confucian influence is the strongest in Chinese tradition. There is Taoists, there are Buddhists, but Confucian is most influential. If you read Confucian Analects, you find Confucius is very radical, a very rational philosopher and thinker. There are many, many passages that speak of the idea of dead souls and so on. His student asked him, first of all, there's one famous statement Confucius says. He doesn't want to talk about deities, spirits, strange things, and this kind of thing, supernatural, superhuman. He doesn't want to talk about this. And there's a famous passage, a student asked him, how to serve the ancestors, the soul of them, because in China, ancestor worship is very old. And how to serve the dead, basically. Confucius says, you figure out how to serve the living first before you figure out how to, there are so many problems with the living, why you're concerned about the dead. And then his student goes on to ask the meaning of death. He says, you should first understand the meaning of life, before you talk about death. So you see, the underworld, the dead, all these are so important for all religions. Confucius refused to talk about them. So that is a very different attitude. There's also a very funny passage actually in the Analects. Confucius says, when you go to ritual to worship, you should think the spirits as if the spirits were there. If you go to a ritual to worship God, you should assume as if gods are there. So the very important word, as if I translate as if in Chinese, called 如祭神如神在. If you go to worship gods, you assume as though the God was there or were there. I mean, he never said it's there. So basically saying, if you go to ritual, you should be serious. You should have a serious attitude to worship whatever you want to worship, but assume they're there. But he never affirmed the existence of gods. So in that sense, he's skeptic. And under that influence, China never had a church, never had a religion as powerful as the Christian church or the synagogue or the Muslims, their mosques, right? The worship places. In China, of course, there's a lot of Buddhist temples, but Buddhism was never a powerful religion. For the Chinese, therefore, becomes for the Chinese literati, and of course, Buddhism came to China in the 1st century, and through many centuries, gradually assimilated into Chinese culture, become typically in China, I would say 3 teachings: Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhism. Confucian is most influential in social life. Taoist is more philosophical, and Buddhism is more sort of religion. But religion was never considered very important. So for traditional literati officials, the Chinese scholars and writers and poets, they would always assimilate 3 teachings. You would not just be a Buddhist, So it's no contradiction in modern China. Somebody like me, I love to visit churches, not from a religious point of view. I just love the architecture and the paintings and all that. So when I go to Europe, I always go to the church and look at that. But for me, it's not a contradiction to visit a Buddhist temple in the morning, in the afternoon, or even a Confucian temple. For Chinese, that's not a problem. But can you imagine that? For a Muslim to go to a Christian church and also go to a mosque? It's impossible, right? So that is a big difference. In that sense then, a lot of things you can derive from this lack of a religious importance religion in China as very different from the West or from the Muslim world. And that is precisely why in 18th century, after the Reformation, after the Renaissance, Enlightenment philosophers became so enamored with Confucianism and China, because they thought China has become a secular state, as they were trying to set up a secular state. And because the modernity first is defined by the separation of church and state, and they thought China has done that. So I think in that sense, you can understand a very big difference in the 2 different systems, social systems, and also systems of philosophy and religion. So indeed, I'm not saying that China is just like the West, very different.
Trying to link the points you presented was yesterday and today. I think we've been moving along the role and the importance of literature scholarship, as you mentioned at different points, and mainly of comparative studies to, cross-cultural understanding and leaving a little bit aside misunderstanding. Because, the number of contemporary conflicts is so high. And I think that listening to you, both days, yesterday and today, leads us to a closer and more specific understanding of comparative studies, their role, which to several of our students, graduate students, many times is not so clear, right? Or, not that's unclear, but it's not exactly very connected to an outside reality. And I think that listening to you and reflecting about the points you mentioned, the conflicts, the importance of relative concepts, this question of the other, the different, and I think we move along this. These were some of your points yesterday and today, right? In terms of the role of comparative studies.
Yes, I always believe that what we do in comparative studies, comparative literature and comparative cross-cultural understanding has a very real connection with what we do, what we live in our world. I really do believe, I'm not just saying this as though to sound more important, I do believe what we do, even though what we do is very scholarly, academic, we're discussing literature and works and so on, but not directly talking about politics or whatever. But I do believe to achieve cross-cultural understanding is a very important way to avoid many of the problems we have faced today. Particularly, I think, now even though since the end of the Second World War, we have 70 years, by and large, peace in the world. We don't have anything like the Second World War killing that on that massive scale. But then we have local, regional wars almost consistently, conflicts. Sometimes we don't even know, but now of course there's more reports and it's easier to get in the news. We all know that there are so many conflicts, particularly in the Arabic world. Look at Iraq, Syria, all these places, and creates such a big problem of migrants and asylum seekers and so on. So I think this has something to do. Of course, it's more than just we can solve in humanities, because there are real interests, for example, behind this. For oil, for control of certain things and so on. But I do believe there is also a huge lack of cross-cultural understanding. When you do that understanding, it's much easier to sort of demonize the other. Yesterday we were talking about in medieval time that Arabic scholars coming on Aristotle, and it's very important influence on the Renaissance. But it's very easy to, nowadays, after the 9/11, to think of Masterman as a suicide bomber, as a terrorist. I think this is very dangerous. Yes. Of course, there are terrorists. They do have violent acts. But I think if we promote cross-cultural understanding, particularly literary, I don't believe, literature, I do believe, has a civilizing influence. People who read poetry, love poetry, probably would be more difficult for the person to kill somebody, even though it's not absolute. But I do believe if you love poetry, you read different poetry of different culture, even if your enemy's literature, you probably will become more humane at least. I think it's really important. So I do believe there is connection, there is relevance of what we do to the world we are living in. It's very important, I think, to have this. And in particular nowadays, probably this is true, probably this is less true in Brazil. I find this very interesting because last week in Uberlândia, when we have the ABRALIC conference, there are so many young people, students coming to the conference and listen. I find it's very, very encouraging. In other parts of the world, I must say, in America, even in China, this is less so. People are much more practical-minded, thinking of what you learn must have something to do with your salary when you graduate to have a job, and less interested in humanities. And humanities become marginalized almost everywhere. So particularly in times of this, I think we must believe ourselves in the value of the humanities. If we don't believe in the value of humanities, do you think that the engineers and lawyers can argue for you? And this is also my criticism of some of the so-called radical theories in postmodernism. basically thinking of literature as representing a kind of repressive ideology, either the patriarchy or some kind of, colonial power and so on. Of course, there are some works like this. I mean, for example, I can give one example. In 18th century English literature, you have the Daniel Defoe. He has this famous work of Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe has a sequel he wrote, in which this fictional Robinson Crusoe went to China and really living in China and described the Chinese reality as being so bad, and he couldn't understand why the 17th century Englishmen were so enamored with China. What's good of China? Our one man of war, a ship, can defeat all the junks of the Chinese, and so on. So you do find this kind of writing, of course, that representing the kind of already the European expansion and colonialism and imperialism ideas of that. But I don't think because of this you can negate all of English literature. You cannot just because of this work even negate all of Daniel Defoe's work.
And Longxi, in the beginning of the novel, if you remember, Robinson Crusoe came to Brazil.
Yes,
That's true, that's true.
indeed. Yeah.
With the same reason. But
Yes. So we're in the same boat, because the Chinese we're all sort of marginalized barbarians. But who is the civilized? Who is the barbarian? It's a big question. Yeah. Indeed, so you do find works like this, but just like in human life, there are good people, there are bad people, there are criminals in our society. Therefore, you cannot say the whole of humanity is bad. So I think this is to be, and then because of this argument, why people don't want to talk about aesthetic literary values? Because basically literature is often represented as dead white males, representing the patriarchy, representing the repressive ideology and so on. And then it's difficult. Now professors of literature are condemning literature as bad. So who is going to defend you? You don't want to rely on the engineers and scientists and say, well, literature is important. They are even better than us. No, nobody's going to say that. So I think I have an essay actually published in the French review de littérature comparative, arguing precisely the value, the crisis. So actually, they asked me, there's a special issue on the crisis of the humanities. That is one of my arguments. Because when you find the influential theorists are talking about how bad the humanities tradition is, then of course humanities is marginalized, because you marginalize yourself. It is very, very important to believe and argue for the value of humanities, for the value of literature. As I said, literature has a civilizing effect, has a good influence. Literature becomes more human, becomes more ethically sympathetic. And of course, many other important critics also argue that. For example, Martha Nussbaum is one good example. She writes many, many books on how use the Greek tragedies to teach our values. And she also has a book called, actually quoting me in that book, called Cultivating Humanity, in defense of liberal education. And she's always using Greek tragedies and classic works to argue for the effect of humanizing, because cultivating humanities is exactly what Seneca says, the value of literature, of humanities. So we don't have many people argue this, so I think we should have more people to argue for the value of humanities. And I do believe if we have more humanistic study and understanding, then the world would become a better place to live.